Yes. We found that CBS was covering Israeli deaths at a rate of 202%. And they were covering Palestinian deaths at a rate of 54%. Now, of course, the question is, how can they exceed 100% of deaths? Well, what we were really astounded to see is that it was not rare for our media to exceed 100% coverage of Israeli deaths, because we were counting every mention, every report of a death that was being made of either population. And we found that quite frequently there would be follow-up reports about Israeli deaths, so that one death would often be reported on twice. So it's this kind of disparity that we discovered. Now, in 2004, did these patterns get better? You would hope that maybe, our reporters and our editors would improve over time. And we found that was not the case. We found that basically they held the same. And in fact, in a number of cases, the distortion that we found in the first year had grown even greater. We saw that ABC, for example, reported on 157% of Israeli deaths, and at the same time they reported on 39% of Palestinian deaths. In other words, a disparity of 4-to-1. We noticed that with CBS, the ratio of differential between reporting on the two populations was also about 4-to-1. They had reported on Israeli deaths 3.8 times greater. And we found that NBC was actually worse than those two. It had reported Israeli deaths at a rate 4.4 times greater. These are enormous differences. We have to be careful not to sort of say, oh, that's not bad, it's only 3 times greater. Some variation is certainly allowable. It's difficult to gather all the deaths and to do a perfect job. Certainly none of us should expect or ask for perfection from our media. But when you have distortion that's over 2 times greater, that's a major factor, and we're seeing it 3 and 4 times greater. Now, what's even more troubling is when you look at how children's deaths are being covered. Because children's deaths, of course, are especially tragic to so many of us. Almost everyone throughout the world feels that children are illegitimate targets of strife. Their deaths are intolerable. They're something that the world should prevent. So it's very important to see how our media are reporting on the large numbers of children that have been killed in this conflict. Now again, the first thing that we always should ask, and I hope we'll always remember to do this everywhere, is how many children were killed among both populations. When we hear a number among one population anywhere in the world, let's always ask, well, what about the other population? I want the full information. So again, we had the very sad job of looking at how many children were killed in this conflict in the first year and then again last year. We discovered that in the first year, 28 Israeli children had been tragically killed. And we discovered that 131 Palestinian children had been tragically killed during that first year. Now let's look at 2004, a period of relative calm, as our media were telling us. Well, again, we find a difference. It's very significant. We learned that 2004, 8 Israeli children had been tragically killed by Palestinians, and we learned that 179 Palestinian children had been tragically killed by Israelis. In other words, Palestinian children were being killed last year at a rate 22 times greater than Israeli children. Now here's an example of what the New York Times covered in that first year. We found that the New York Times covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate 6.8 times greater than Palestinian children's deaths. They reported on 125% of Israeli children's deaths, and for that same year, they reported on 18% of Palestinian children's deaths. Let's look at what they did in 2004. In 2004, we found that the disparity had grown even greater, and the New York Times reported on Israeli children's deaths at a rate over 7 times greater than they had reported on Palestinian children's deaths. Then you look at the TV networks, and they make the New York Times almost look good. The television networks, the disparity in coverage of children's deaths is truly off the charts, which of course is the name of our reports. And as we describe our reports, you'll see how that phrase continues to fit the media coverage off the charts. So we found that the networks had covered once again Israeli children's deaths at far greater rates. And remember, we're not even measuring how much time was spent on each death, the wording that was used, how much personal information was given. I have no doubt that that would increase this differential even far greater than I'm describing. We're just talking about a death even having been reported or having been mentioned and finding enormous distortion there. We found that in the first year of covering children's deaths, ABC covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate 13.8 times greater than Palestinian children's deaths. We discovered that CBS covered Israeli deaths at a rate 6.4 times greater than Palestinian children's deaths. We discovered that NBC covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate about 12.5 times greater than Palestinian children's deaths. These are all children. Their deaths are all tragic. Why are we hearing about one population's deaths at a rate up to 13 times greater than we're hearing about another population's deaths? As Americans, we need full information, not information about only one population. Then we look at what the networks did in 2004. In 2004, we found that, again, this immense distortion was going on. We discovered that ABC covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate 9 times greater, CBS covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate almost 13 times greater, and NBC covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate approximately 10 times greater. Once again, a huge differential based on ethnicity in the reporting that we're getting from our media. Another way of looking at these deaths is in the following charts, where we show on one side the Israeli column is in blue, and you'll see that the top half of the column is a different shade of blue. Those are the repetitions of deaths that were reported in our media, where that makes the blue column, which is the Israeli death column, look significantly higher than the amount of death that was actually going on the ground. Then you compare that to the red column, the Palestinian column, and you'll notice that the top half, far more than half, I'm afraid, of that column is a vast empty column of Palestinian deaths that were never even reported once, making the Palestinian death column look far smaller than it was in reality. Now, of course, though, that empty column is full of tragedy. Every one of those children or men or women, whoever was killed, is still being mourned by their families, and yet their deaths were invisible to the American population, whose tax money Israel is using. That's why we have to know these facts. Another very revealing way of looking at these deaths is to chart them chronologically. In the following chart, the first line that you'll see is how the New York Times reported the deaths, the Israeli deaths. Now, in the next line, we'll show you the number of Israeli deaths that had actually occurred during that first year. Now, the next line will show how Palestinian deaths were reported in that first year. And the final line will be the number of Palestinian deaths that actually had occurred during that year. As you'll see, in time after time after time, the curves all follow the Israeli death rate, rather than the Palestinian reported deaths following their own death rate. This is startling to me, and I suspect will be startling to many people. Now, I'd like to just mention a few other studies, in addition to these major media that I've just described. Many people perhaps listen to NPR, to National Public Radio, and consider them considerably better. In fact, a number of years ago,